Durnford waited until the Zulus were around 400 yards away before he opened fire with two volleys, and then his men galloped back to another position in a donga further back. By now, he only had his core force of about 75 men with him. And what they would do is that three of them would fire, whilst the fourth man would hold four horses. Now, they had practiced this tactic extensively, and it went smoothly, apart from the fact that they were unfortunately utterly outnumbered. Meanwhile, back in camp, Colonel Pullein received a message from Lord Chelmsford ordering him to strike camp and set off after Lord Chelmsford. Pullein was reported as being nonplussed by this because he was facing an almost impossible situation. There was now heavy firing audible in the distance in the direction that Durnford had gone, but almost certainly he couldn't actually see for himself what was going on. Anyway, he sounded the alarm and he assembled his troops, and he wrote a hasty note back to Chelmsford stating that he couldn't strike the camp at present due to heavy firing in the distance. And that was the right thing to do. Now, and for the first time, there came the noise of an infantry company firing volleys. It was E Company, commanded by this chap, Lieutenant Charles Cavey. The company had been sent forward to the Tahalani Spur, where they were confronted by a large body of Zulus. I've marked them in green at the top there. The Zulus were jogging along a dry stream bed ahead of E Company. They were moving parallel to E Company and obviously heading west as if to move behind Isandlwana. Lieutenant Cavey ordered his company to begin volley firing, and E Company took a fearsome toll of the Zulus. Incredibly, the Zulus simply ignored them and jogged on their way as Zulus fell left and right to the firing of E Company. What in fact was happening is that this was the Zulu right horn, which was to move behind the camp and then close in from behind the camp. Now, Colonel Pullein could hear the firing, but he couldn't actually see what Lieutenant Cavey was firing at because the Zulus were out of sight in dead ground. Nevertheless, he now decided to reinforce E Company, and he sent F Company, commanded by Captain William Mostyn, who you can see there, plus two companies of the NNC, native troops, again forward to the Tahalani Spur to join E Company. Pullein also moved the two artillery guns 400 yards forward to a ridge line, and he sent with them Captain William de Geisha's A Company to protect the guns. And those guns he ordered to provide covering fire for Colonel Durnford's retreat. Remember, Durnford is now falling back steadily. Now, thing was that Pullein could actually see Durnford by now, and he could see Durnford's predicament. He could see him falling back, donga to donga, and that's why he ordered the guns to provide covering fire. Pullein has been criticized at this stage for dividing his force, and with hindsight, this is an easy charge to level. But at the time he made these decisions, he had no way of knowing the scale of the attack and the numbers of the Zulu. And to reinforce Lieutenant Cavey and E Company against an invisible enemy was perfectly sensible. So let me summarize the situation. In the south, down the bottom of the picture there, you have Colonel Durnford falling back towards the camp, while in the north, on the Tahlani Spur area, the British deployment now consisted of F and E companies of the 24th, together with two companies of the NNC, as well as A company of the 24th Regiment, plus the two artillery guns not far away. Their position was around a mile from the camp, and they all now became subject to Zulu attack. In fact, the immediate situation of these men was quite stable because their disciplined and accurate fire was keeping the Zulus at bay at ranges of between 400 and 800 yards. But the sheer enormity of the Zulu attack must by now have become clear to Colonel Pullein, as he would have seen an enormous wave of black humanity beginning to roll over the distant hilltops and move across the entire front from northwest to southeast. And they would have been swarming towards his camp at speed. It must have been a terrifying and bewildering sight. Quickly, it became apparent that the sheer numbers of the Zulus were allowing them to spread left and right and threaten to surround the troops on the Tahlani Spur. So Pullein sent up C Company under Captain Younghusband there to cover the withdrawal of those companies on the Tahlani Spur back towards the camp. Well, the force fell back slowly and with few casualties. The situation was still stable, morale was high, and the men were confident. Now, we know this because one Lieutenant Horace Smith-Dorian was up with them for a time, and he was not part of the 24th Regiment. He was attached for a time, but he was to survive the battle, and he was to talk about it. And he was a very able and intelligent man because he was to reach the rank of full general and in the First World War and command the Second Army on the Western Front. Well, back to Colonel Pullein. He now faced a situation he hadn't foreseen, and actually nor could he have foreseen. He had troops deployed north of the camp on the Tahlani Spur, although they were slowly falling back. But he also had Durnford's force conducting a fighting withdrawal to the east. Pullein had to make a snap plan, and he decided to try to establish a solid firing line with his companies, with his left flank anchored on Isandlwana Hill and his right flank on the conical kopje, near where Durnford was fighting as he fell back. Trouble is, he was too late for this. But to try and achieve it, he sent H Company under Captain Wardell, you can see there, and G Company under Lieutenant Pope, and he sent them both forward on his right, as you can see there. You can see G and H companies. Well, accurate and disciplined volley fire at 600 yards or so, the Zulus could be effectively stopped for a while, and they were unable to close the companies. The two guns helped. They fired their 76mm or 3-inch shells, those shells weighing over 3 kilos, with a range of some 2 miles. But of course, these two guns were but a drop in the ocean. Unfortunately for Pullein, the gaps between the companies were extensive, and the Zulus would clearly soon be able to infiltrate between the companies and outflank them. He had no option but to order a slow general withdrawal back towards the camp. As the companies withdrew, their frontage lessened, and it's estimated that at some stage, his firing line from C to G companies would have been approximately 1 British soldier for every 3 to 6 yards of front. Well, by now, Colonel Pauline would have been receiving reports that in addition to the enormous numbers of Zulus advancing towards him from north and east, large numbers of Zulus were streaming west in order to get behind Isandlwana Hill. And although his companies were falling back steadily and holding the Zulus at bay by their volley fire, the possibility of defeat must now have occurred to him. To the east, Durnsford's force was galloping back galloping around and to the south of the conical kopje, hotly pursued by an estimated 9,000 Zulus. He'd lost, although he may not have realized it yet, the rocket troop, that's Durnford, had lost the rocket troop because they'd got separated from him and they had been overrun by the Zulus. Durnford would have seen by now the rifle companies of the 24th Regiment deployed, and he would have realized that the southern flank was largely open and vulnerable if the Zulus were allowed to push south and west. So Durnford decided to make a stand along the edge of the Nyogani Donga. That's about a mile from Isandlwana Hill. And his intention was to stop the Zulu advance in the south at that point. And you can see down at the bottom of the picture where Durnford decided to make a firm stand, as opposed to constantly falling back. Well, we know from a few British survivors and from many Zulus that the battle had become fairly static at this stage. The British volley fire prevented large numbers of Zulus from closing much closer than around 400 yards. The Zulus took cover in the long grass and they crept forward, only rising up from time to time for those with rifles to fire at the British. Therefore, the British volley fire was no longer necessary. Soldiers would only fire at individual Zulus who exposed themselves for brief periods. So, at this stage, British casualties ought to have been low. And yet, we know that from a surviving bandsman who acted as a stretcher bearer, that the Surgeon Major had ordered all of them back to the hospital tent because of the large number of casualties. Now, what might have been causing these casualties? Well, a fact is that, and it's often overlooked, is that the Zulus actually outgunned the British. Yes, the British Martini Henry was far superior to the obsolete Zulu muzzle-loading guns, and yes, the British soldiers were highly skilled in their shooting, but around 1 in 4 Zulus carried a firearm of some sort, and even primitive, badly aimed firearms will cause casualties when deployed in overwhelming numbers. Now, it's quite possible that among the the first British casualties were several officers. While the rank and file soldiers of the 24th Regiment would have fired and then knelt or dropped down to reload, their officers would not have taken cover. The army ethos of the time was that officers did not take cover, but stood and encouraged the troops by their bearing and manner. It would take the bitter experiences of the Boer War 20 years later to change this behaviour. Well, with heavy volley firing from time to time by the British and the vast number of targets for the Martini Henrys, the subject of ammunition supply warrants careful examination. With little evidence to support it, myths have sprung up about ammunition shortages due to overzealous quartermasters or ammunition boxes that were impossible to open. It is not true that the 2 quartermasters refused ammunition to men that were not from their own battalions. It's not true that the ammunition boxes were impossible to open. It's not true that there was a shortage of screwdrivers, and it's not true that the firing line was short of ammunition at that time. Captain Essex of the 75th Regiment, who was attached and would also become a survivor, he took part in organizing an ammunition resupply out to the companies by grabbing all the spare men he could find who were wandering around the camp and using them. Now, there were over 400,000 rounds of ammunition available in the camp. The men of the 24th Regiment had deployed that morning with 70 rounds per man, and there were 200 rounds per man in the wagons in the camp. In 1879, rifle ammunition came in the Mark V hardwood box, which you can see there, which contained 60 waxed packets, each of 10 rounds, and it weighed 80 pounds. There was a sliding lid on the top of the box. It was held closed by a 2-inch screw. Inside was a thin tin liner, which was opened by a sardine can type pull handle. Now, these boxes could be easily opened by the blows of a rifle butt, or could be wrenched open with a bayonet. Also, the regimental pioneers would have been stationed with the quartermasters, and the regimental pioneers had plenty of screwdrivers, mallets, crowbars, and so on. So let's now return for a moment to Colonel Durnford and his troops. That's the tinfoil cover. Well, Durnford down in the south there, at the bottom of the picture, as you know, decided to make a stand at the Nyagani Donga, and he wanted to hold that position at all costs. He'd been reinforced by some mounted Basutos, and also the men of the Edendale force. They're all native horsemen. In all, he had around 180 men, but he was facing thousands of Zulus, and yet he was managing to hold them back quite effectively. And Zulus later told how they were stopped by Durnford's fire, and that all they could see of Durnford and his men were their helmets, because they were fighting from the edge of a donga, and most of their bodies were down below the surface. Durnford himself went up and down his line, encouraging his men and dismounting from time to time to help a man clear a jammed rifle. Well, that's all very well, but Durnford was a colonel, and he should have been addressing the big picture of the battle as a whole. In other words, how could he best tie in with Colonel Pauline's infantry? He doesn't seem to have done this, and confirmation comes from the testimony of a Lieutenant Henderson of the Mounted Basutos, who was a survivor, who stated that Durnford really didn't know what to do and lost his head. Now, I think I can see this mental confusion explaining his preoccupation with helping men to clear their jammed rifles. His mind was confused, and he was taking refuge from facing up to making difficult decisions by engaging in the purely mechanical work of helping a man to clear a jammed rifle. Well, whatever is the case, he now began to run short of ammunition and sent horsemen back to the camp for more. And now we come to the great turning point in the battle. The British situation seemed stable, but this was an illusion. While the main 24th firing line was intact and holding off the Zulus in the north and northeast, there were no reserves to deal with the Zulus of the Zulu right wing, who were by now behind Isandlwana Hill. And now large bodies of Zulus also swarmed out of the Dongas well to the south. And they now began to move around Durnford, cunningly staying out of rifle fire range. And they now threatened to cut off Durnford's whole force. Durnford was running low on ammunition anyway, and so he had no option but to now retreat back towards the camp. Pauline would have seen Durnford's withdrawal in horror, and he now ordered all his companies to fall back to the camp for a last stand. Probably he wanted to make a battalion square. And if he'd been able to make a battalion square right from the beginning, using the carts drawn up in a liga and with all the ammunition available in boxes, opened and ready, the result would have been very difficult. Very different. Well, C, F, and E companies, as you can see there, they wouldn't have actually been in sight of what was happening down in the south with Durnford. And so they actually thought they were holding off the Zulus pretty well. And they would probably have been quite mystified when they heard the bugle calls to fall back to the camp. Now, everything I've told you thus far has been based on first-hand British survivor testimony. But over the next 45 minutes, the rifle companies of the 24th Regiment all perished without a single survivor. There were survivors who witnessed some of the events from a long way away, but many of them almost certainly suffered from survivor's guilt syndrome and embellished the facts in order to justify to themselves and others their reasons to flee. What does seem certain is that there was no collapse of the 24th Regiment, the rifle companies. They fought on for up to 45 minutes with no panic, no scattering, and they were not immediately swamped. They stood shoulder to shoulder and back to back, and they volleyed hard for as long as the ammunition lasted, and then they used the bayonet. They were skilled professionals. They were stubborn, especially in adversity, and there was a strong regimental ethos. From the evidence of where the bodies lay, and here you can see the place the men fell being marked across the battlefield with cairns, we know that at least half of the 24th Regiment managed to fall back to the saddle area where the camp was, indicating that they still had sufficient ammunition to hold off the Zulus and were not cut off.